We're going to shift gears a bit here, and our next presenter is Richard Beck. He's a vice president with Michael Baker International and serves as the project manager for the Carlsbad Sea Level Rise and Local Coastal Program Update and Zoning Update Project. Mr. Beck has extensive experience in the regulatory and environmental disciplines, specifically those associated with coastal areas. He currently serves as president of the Society of Wetland Scientists, Western Chapter, which covers the southwestern United States. Mr. Beck is currently working on coastal restoration projects, infrastructure protection projects in San Diego and Newport Bays, and a large-scale beach nourishment project in Malibu, California. Please join me in welcoming Richard Beck.
Thank you. On here. Great, well, thank you very much. Well, good. What a great evening to talk about so many technical issues, but I think our past speakers have really laid it out where it's understandable and something that we could take home, and when we see news articles and see papers, we can better understand all of this and bring it home a little bit more. And that's what I'd like to do tonight, to talk about the project that we've been working on closely with the city on the sea level rise, as well as concurrently the local coastal program update, and then bringing the tail around with the zoning update at the end of the project. And it's truly been a great process so far, and it's one that takes an integrated approach. It's been great working with city staff as we all together work with the Coastal Commission and have a transparent process. I'm joined with some excellent colleagues, Brian Leslie with Moffitt Nickel, a coastal scientist who's focusing on the sea level rise component of the project. And then also my colleague Tad Stern, a senior coastal planner with Michael Baker. I'd like to just bring this all home a little bit to understand all of that information that we've been talking about tonight. What does it really mean for Carlsbad? How can this information be used in a planning sense to make the community better and to protect our coastal resource? And what this graphic shows with the pictures, there's a faint red line on there, but it's the coastal zone within Carlsbad. So the coastal zone extends along the state, and it was actually set by the state legislature, and then it's under the purview of the California Coastal Commission that came about by voter initiative in 1972. And the coastal zone, if it were one big area, it's actually larger than the state of Rhode Island. So we're talking about a very important piece of our state. And as you know, a bulk of our population lives within usually 50 miles and along those coastal areas. So one thing we're moving forward with as we talk about sea level rise is the local coastal program that the city actually already has, but like many cities, it's seeking to amend and update that program to take into account new issues like sea level rise. So over the last couple of years, several local agencies, cities, and counties have received grants from the California Coastal Commission. And those grants have allowed the cities to move forward using that funding to study sea level rise and then apply it to the local coastal program. We'll see it will be noted as an LCP, referred to LCP several times throughout the conversation. And the LCP really is the rule book on what happens within the coastal zone as far as coastal development and coastal protection. Why this is so important is the city is able to use that local coastal program to help approve projects and protect the coastline through a variety of policies and other zoning codes. This is a brief picture that just highlights the main process that we're working through. And what it really focuses on is close coordination with the Coastal Commission. Oftentimes we're having monthly meetings, quarterly meetings, and then also speaking at the coastal hearings. Through that process is meetings like this where we have strong community engagement. We'll have at the end of this slide presentation other avenues where you can get involved and track how this project moves along throughout the process over the next year. We also bring in our new studies that we're looking into. The sea level rise data that's coming out and constantly changing, that gets incorporated into the plan, as well as the recent general plan update. All of that turns into a document where we're then able to develop land use tools and land use patterns for the city, especially the coastal areas. And that allows us to come up with zoning and other policies that help protect and help us adapt when we talk about sea level rise issues. Finally, once the city approves the document, it goes to the California Coastal Commission for approval, and it becomes the latest and greatest living document, really, for the city to address local coastal issues. So what are a lot of those issues that we face? Well, you can see a lot of these, each day that we come across these issues as far as coastal access. What's happening with the beaches, specifically with the state park, who's a major player in the area. Also, the unique topography. One thing when we look at all these maps and the detail, it's just amazing, the coastline of Carlsbad, from the beaches to the bluffs, and then all of a sudden these amazing lagoons. Well, all of them are impacted differently through sea level rise, and that's the purpose of our study, is to understand how those impacts will influence those land uses and those natural features. Also, the location of visitor-serving uses. And other issues like maintaining agricultural lands and already open space areas that will remain open space now and beyond. And finally, trip reduction, traffic congestion, all of those things that communities looked to reduce through different programs and little planning tools. So this is the process where we take the science and turn it into policy, and it's what the public's using on a daily basis, certainly the planners at the city. And what we want to do is have an approach that maximizes communication between each one of these different stages of the project. No stage is more important than the other. They're just at different times, and you'll find that they continue to build upon each other as we go through. So starting with the sea level rise, defining what the baseline condition is. Using those El Nino discussions and those pictures, there's nothing better. I can explain what flooding may look like in an area for hours if you'd like, but showing you a picture, knowing that you've been in that area, is 10 times better. We can also then take a vulnerability assessment and take a look at, okay, we know the lines of the sea level rise and what that's going to do. How will it impact specific uses? We then turn towards our local coastal program and then again, add those uses, add those impacts, and see how can we work together to create policies to lessen or mitigate those impacts as we go in the future. And finally, adaptation planning. How can we adapt through the use of those policies? And we'll have plenty of examples on our adaptation techniques in a little bit. Well, you've heard about all the issues when we take a look at sea level rise. It's not just the fact that the sea level is rising. It's rising, and then you have a high tide, and then you have a large storm event, and it's almost compounding. So for Carlsbad, on the x-axis, we have years, with 2050 being the red line. It's kind of a milestone that we're looking at. The model actually goes out to 2100, but I know for most of us in the room, we're concerned with 2050 at best. On the y-axis, we've projected the sea level rise, so that's height in feet. And as you can see, there's a low and a high, and when we talk about planning and adaptation, we really want to focus on that worst case scenario. So that, for 2050, and our baseline is 2 feet of sea level rise. And of course, it has different implications on where you are in the city. The lagoons versus the bluffs, for example, handle sea level rise differently. Here's one of those great pictures. Time and time again we've seen, and when we leave the room tonight, when people say, oh, El Nino didn't happen, well, maybe on a precipitation basis in Southern California it didn't really come through. But when we look at those tides, we had some of the largest tides in 80 to 100 years. And what a perfect picture example on using that as we talk about sea level rise and future planning. We also know our coastline. So locally, those bluffs, they're already currently eroding. This is a natural process. What happens and what the concern is that process is speeding up and it's becoming unnatural, and it does impact the current setting as we know it today. So what are we using? Well, the scientists at Moffitt Nichol are using a program called COSMOS. So I know you'll go up to the space real quick, bring it back down. It's not Cosmos as we know it as far as the stars and the moon, but it stands for the Coastal Storm Modeling System for Southern California. And this application or version of Cosmos really covers from Point Conception all the way south to the border. And what it does is it allows for detailed mapping over large-scale areas. And it basically highlights the sea level rise into account with higher tides and storm events. So there's various inputs that go into that model, and then there's outputs. And what it provides us is it provides us future scenarios for coastal sea level rise, so we can again apply that to our planning policies. Future bluff position, shoreline position, flooding limits, and other uncertainties are all factored in. And that's how these maps are generated, again, based on worst case scenario. There are some assumptions that are listed here. Since it's kind of a high plan view model, it doesn't take into account existing armoring. And one reason for that is we don't know the status of all the armoring as far as seawalls or rock revetment or rock protection for different properties. As you know, there's different life cycle and lifespans of those types of improvements. So that's been taken out of the model. So when we look at bluffs and hazards, it truly is a worst case scenario. And if there are certain protections in place, then that's great. That will continue to be refined as Cosmos comes out with additional versions, and they'll cinch that down and the detail will just get better and better. So here's an example of what the model can show. This is the future bluff edge, for example, within the city in one location. And what it's doing is these thin bands. And of course, in the model, you can zoom in, not everything's at this scale, but there's different colors that are tied to the sea level rise. And what it's showing is it's showing the future edge of the top of the bluff that faces the ocean. And as expected, as sea level rises and you have wave attacks against the bluff will fall and that will begin to retreat backwards. So all of this line work can be tied to specific sea level rise levels and be studied further throughout the document. And you can see some example pictures here, obviously, of the occurring bluff line as we know it now. There's also wetting and drying cycles. So although the storm events and significant flooding are tied to storms and infrequent durations, we have this wetting and drying with each tide. And it was so interesting to hear. There was a question on when you look out and you assume that it's a high tide. No, it's low tide occurring because the beaches are eroding. This wet and drying is a great example to track as things change throughout with sea level rise. Temporary flooding with extreme waves. We've seen these pictures before. Again, it's that sea level rise on top of storm events and high tides that cause areas that typically did not flood to continue to flood. This is an example where it's tidal, but we also see it in our freshwater systems in some of our lagoons like Buena Vista, where you've got the lagoon rise on top of heavy precipitation, which increased flooding and problems with infrastructure as far as some of the outlets that discharge into the lagoon. The report that I'm speaking of, the sea level rise analysis, we broke down the city in a couple of different planning areas. And it's really for convenience. We're able to take each one of those planning areas and really talk about what's happening. So a good example is linear infrastructure like Carlsbad Boulevard. Carlsbad Boulevard changes throughout the city, so we can basically describe it a lot easier throughout the report in these planning areas. Like the maps over here on the wall, you'll see flood maps, and that shows the future sea level rise, again, based on that 2050 date. And most of them will have a legend that highlights the current sea level as well as the sea level rise as it's projected. We can also overlay with different mapping techniques, parcels, infrastructure, and so forth to study. So what is vulnerable? When we talk about vulnerability, we're talking about, first of all, the exposure of buildings, the exposure of critical infrastructure, and then also the sensitivity of those objects. So how likely are they to be impacted, destroyed, or damaged? And then also the adaptive capacity. How can they change as sea level rises? So I'll go through the next slides rather quickly because there's a lot of detail on other maps that we can talk about afterwards, especially during the Q&A session. But just remember when we talk about vulnerability and some of the acreages, it's coastline within the city, so it's citywide and it's cumulative. So, for example, 27 acres of beach are at risk or vulnerable. Now, that's not 27 acres total or connected. It's throughout the city, and that's one of the challenges, is you may have vulnerabilities in certain locations, but not others. The hazard with beaches and a lot of the bluffs is erosion, where they crumble, and then because of the rising sea levels, you're actually losing beach area for recreation and so forth. Exposure to campsites. As you know, there's nothing like picturing the bluff's edge when you're camping at the campground or headed down some of those infamous staircases. Those exposures with erosion are a primary concern with state parks facilities and other facilities along bluffs. Vulnerabilities to buildings. Now, for the buildings, we take a look, typically it's tied to parcel data. So even though a lot of parcels will show flooding, the building itself may actually not be in that flooding area. It depends on the parcel size and the location of the parcel. Critical infrastructure for Carlsbad in the very long term, in that 2100 date, there's some susceptibility for sewer pump stations, for example. But generally in the short term, most of that vulnerability is lower. And then also transportation. As you know, Carlsbad Boulevard and Jefferson Street by the lagoon, there's definitely concerns and vulnerabilities where it hugs the coastline. And as we saw from some of those El Nino pictures, it's already creating some issues on those high tide El Nino storm events. And then sensitive open space lands. Obviously, the exposure is a concern there too, where you may have habitat conversion and modifications. As sea level rises, there's some adaptability for the plants, but you do have a concern of wetland areas becoming submerged and upland areas transitioning to newer wetlands. So the last phase of this is really talking about accommodation or an adaptation. And there's different phases of adaptation and possibilities. And the best way to think about this is as a menu. And during certain locations throughout the city and at certain times, you may want different strategies in place. And what works in one location or one city may not work here. So there's basically different approaches, starting with do nothing, which in some cases works okay in open space lands, for example. There's another accommodation as far as how can we accommodate the sea level rise through design or building techniques, for example. Protect in place, rock revetment, and we'll show other pictures, seawalls, such adaptation measures like that are usually present. And then also inland relocation. Can you possibly move backwards inland and avoid sea level rise with that issue? And then obviously a hybrid of those techniques. And when we move through the adaptation strategies, it's really important to remember for inland relocation, for example, it's not necessarily a commercial building or a house or a road. It could be a trail, all sorts of different land uses. And some of these techniques certainly work well with others, and they're a little bit more difficult and harder to carry out when looking at other land uses. So the next few slides are just pictures of examples. So adaptation here, beach nourishment projects, kind of a green way or a sensitive way of doing shoreline protection. And then we also have gray or hard protection like rock riprap or rock revetment. The only thing with that is you need to remember certain adaptations have secondary impacts. So it's okay to place the rock all throughout the coastline, but the problem is you're starting to lose that recreational area along your beaches. So they do all come with pluses and minuses. Adaptation techniques as far as moving inland, there's an excellent REP project right now up in Morro Bay where they have their treatment plant that's very close, very low lying, and they're actually moving it back, relocating the entire plant a mile inland. Excellent example of relocation. And then also the San Leandro Bridge design. This is a great example of how you can take the transportation corridor and raise the deck of the bridge, and then also widen that ability of the bridge to pass flows underneath through a wider opening. These are good techniques, especially with projects that are moving forward already. Let's make sure we adapt them so they can take an increase in sea level rise. So this is a lot of information, and it's always good while we have cookies in the room because it's information overload. But it's important to get all this information out because what we need to do is coordinate with the stakeholders. There's other players involved throughout the city as far as utilities and other infrastructure that are also moving forward. You saw a great example of what other factors are going on, what others are doing in San Diego County. This is definitely a collaborative, and it's a regional approach, and the city is just one piece of that. So communication and outreach is huge. And then developing those strategies is really the next phase. We know the baseline. We understand where the vulnerabilities are. Now it's time to work together and create those policies, really to create adaptation techniques so we can lessen the impacts of sea level rise. Coming up in the next month or so, we're going to finalize the sea level rise document. And a lot of those graphics are here today. The report is following where we really get into detail as far as land uses and adaptation techniques. And then we'll take that information and put it into our local coastal program. We've met with the Coastal Commission along with city staff already and have shared an outline of the new plan. It's working out really well where each chapter covers a different component and policies throughout the coastal portion of the city. So the best thing you can do is stay involved. You've seen a lot of opportunities to get involved with a lot of different groups. Again, I'd echo you can research a lot of this information on the Coastal Commission's website. It's got their latest guidance as well as more information on local coastal programs. But the city also has a designated website for this project. It's hopefully how you found out about the meeting here tonight. And we're going to move forward and continue to have that webpage updated as the project moves along. So one example of that is we'll be posting the report on the website in the very near future. So you can download that PDF and review it for good light reading, hopefully, now that you're all trained up in the topic. And then finally, at any time, you can always email the planning department at the city. They've been very proactive during this whole project. We look forward to continuing to work with the Coastal Commission as we finish up all these plans and different reports for everyone to use. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Jason.